over the past 20, 30 years, we've understood how an internal biological clock, a circadian rhythm, is generated mechanistically. A bunch of genes interacting, producing proteins, which then can feed back, turn off their own genes. The proteins then get degraded, and you have this cycle of protein production and degradation. So I got into studying mental illness because I had a very irritating conversation with a psychiatrist in an elevator. We've appreciated how important circadian rhythms are to our health and well-being. Every aspect of our biology is being fine-tuned to a greater or lesser extent to the very demands of a planet that revolves once every 24 hours.
The suprachiasmatic nucleus, a little.
I'm sorry, I'm a pedant. I have to correct you.
Yes.
Suprachiasmatic nuclei.
Nuclei. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Russell Foster. It's a pleasure.
I'm really delighted.
So I just read your latest book, Lifetime. It's about biological clocks and circadian rhythm and sleep, and I thought that the science of it was fascinating. So I had to come over and chat with you a little bit.
Well, it's terrific. You crossed the Atlantic for this relatively brief conversation. I'm very honored.
It's been quite swell. England has been very good to me. Oxford is beautiful. But I'm here to chat about science. So I want to ask you about the motivation for writing this book. So you've written about the biological clock and circadian rhythms and sleep, and I think we all have an idea of what those things are broadly. But what motivated you specifically to delve into this so deeply and dedicate your career effectively to this study?
I guess the book arises from several motivations. I mean, one I think is fundamentally the science. I mean, over the past 20, 30 years, we've understood how an internal biological clock, a circadian rhythm, is generated mechanistically. A bunch of genes interacting, producing proteins, which then can feed back, turn off their own genes. The proteins then get degraded, and you have this cycle of protein production and degradation. And of course, the Nobel Prize in 2017 was awarded to the team that first discovered how a clock works in Drosophila. But I think in parallel with that extraordinary, beautiful biology, we've appreciated how important circadian rhythms are to our health and well-being. Every aspect of our biology is being fine-tuned to a greater or lesser extent to the very demands of a planet that revolves once every 24 hours. So I really felt that needed to be articulated. So that was one part of the motivation.
Right.
The other thing was there's some strange stuff rattling around the media.
Okay.
And I was increasingly, I suppose, a bit irritated with statements. You must get 8 hours of sleep. You must do this. And so the sort of the sergeant majors of sleep screaming that, one's got to do this or that. And so, in the 80s, nobody paid any attention to sleep. But by the turn of the century, people were beginning to think, sleep is important. And now a big chunk of the population is terrified about their sleep. And I thought I wanted to demystify it and make the point that one shoe size does not fit all, and it's just like that for sleep. And the critical thing is to take ownership of your sleep and enjoy the sleep that you get. And clearly there are things that we can do, and that advice is embedded in the book. But really, it's stop being afraid of one's sleep.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's sort of all of these narratives floating around. I think in North America, there's this largely entrepreneurial culture where it's almost a badge of honor to get no sleep.
Yeah.
And then you're mentioning there's sort of these ideas in maybe health media or science media that may or may not be correct, but I don't think they're pitched exactly the right way. So your book is very timely in that way. I want to get you to define what you mean by a biological clock. Let's say from a more scientific standpoint.
Sure.
What exactly are you referring to when you study the biological clock?
It's a really important point. And essentially, you can define a circadian rhythm, a 24-hour biological clock, but the fact that it will persist under constant conditions. So if you or I went to a deep, dark cave, constant light, constant temperature, we'd still show near 24-hour rhythms. They wouldn't be exactly 24 hours. In most of us, they're a little bit longer, but the persistence of a 24-hour rhythm without any time cues like light or dark or changes in temperature, that's a key point. The second is that this endogenous internal clock can be aligned to the external world. And the primary way that happens in most animals, most life in fact, is exposure to the light-dark cycle, the dawn-dusk cycle. So it persists under constant conditions. It can be entrained by a time giver from the environment. And the third extraordinary point is that it's temperature compensated. And what I mean by that is that biological reactions speed up or slow down depending upon what the external temperature is. Now, if you have a clock and it changes its oscillation, its period, with temperature, it's not a clock. It can't work. And so that's the third, really extraordinary feature. And in fact, it is amazing that clocks, biological clocks, are indeed temperature compensated. We don't fully understand how, but they are. And so those are the three factors.
That's fantastic in terms of just defining exactly what we're talking about. So when you say biological clock and just how important this is to our functioning and every aspect of our functioning, it leads me to wonder, just as a layperson, where is this magical biological clock located within me? Because I feel like, the sun rises and then I wake up in response and then I go about my day. It's dark and I go to sleep again.
Yeah.
But you're implying that it's deeply embedded in us.
Oh, it is. It's I think in the book I call it our deep biology. That might have been a bit too dramatic, but give me a bit of license on that one. So if we think about anatomically, do we have a master clock within the brain? And we do. And in fact, some of the work I did when I was based at the University of Virginia with Martin Ralph, who is now at the University of Toronto, and Michael Menaker, they really pushed the discovery of this master clock within the brain. It's deep in the hypothalamus. It's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. It's a paired structure, about 50,000 cells. And the wonderful thing is that each one of those cells can generate its own 24-hour oscillation, and they're all coupled together to produce this master clock, which is regulated by light, which we can talk about in a moment. Mm-hmm. And we thought that the master clock, and this was back in the, I suppose, early 90s, was just essentially forcing rhythmicity on the rest of the body. It was changing, it was interacting with the pituitary gland, causing the rhythmic release of hormones, or, changing blood vasculature to give more blood to muscles during the day and less so at night. But then Uli Schubler, and I was at the meeting where he showed his data for the first time, showed that cells outside of this master clock, the SCN, could generate a circadian rhythm. And there was almost an audible gasp in the lecture theatre because, it changed our idea. It wasn't that the master clock was driving rhythmicity in the body, it was coordinating rhythmicity in billions and billions of individual cellular oscillators, which are grouped into the organ systems and the tissues of the body. So it's this incredible circadian network. So we tend to think about the circadian system rather than the biological clock, because there are billions in our body. And I just think that is just so cool. I think it's remarkable, actually. That
is quite fascinating. So you say that there's circadian system, and then it interacts with the environment. And you specifically mentioned light exposure.
Yeah.
So what's the interaction there, and how does light regulate our circadian rhythm?
This is my career.
You're the right guy for the job.
But I'll try and be brief.
Sure.
So I was fascinated, really. Okay, we know we got the circadian system, but how is the internal clock system aligned to the external world? And we knew light dark was critical. Mammals who have no eyes, or if you cover their eyes, cannot entrain this clock. So the clock keeps on ticking, but it drifts with its own period through time. Now, it's in the eye, but the real problem I had is that the sensory task of vision, grabbing light by the rods and the cones, the visual cells of the eye, is a very different sensory task from the regulation of circadian rhythms. So what the visual system has to do is grab light and then in a fraction of a second, forget it's seen it. It's building an image of our world. What the clock needs is exposure to light over long periods at sort of dawn and dusk.
Okay.
So you're integrating light over long periods of time. And it was unclear how that was actually being achieved by the by the defined receptors within the eye, the rods and cones. So I started this work at the University of Virginia when I was based there, using mice with hereditary retinal disorders. They were mice that were being studied to try and understand human eye disease. And what was truly extraordinary is that mutations whereby the visual cells had largely broken down, they'd largely degenerated, those mice could regulate their clock with normal sensitivities. And we thought, oh, wow, that's extraordinary. And I remember giving a talk at a big vision meeting and saying, well, our data are consistent with the fact that there must be something else in the eye, another light sensor. And one chap at the back of the auditorium stood up, and I thought he was asking a question, and looked me in the eye and just said, bullshit, and walked out. And, the idea, and one person said to me with incredible anger, are you really telling us that after 150 years of study of the eye, the best understood part of the central nervous system, we have all missed a novel receptor within the eye, and you have found it? And of course, I was much younger, full of sort of confidence.
Right.
Think, well, that's consistent with the data. But the big criticism was, okay, well, perhaps it's just a small number of rods and cones left in the eye, and that's all you need to regulate the clock. Now, there's good theoretical reasons why that was wrong, but what we had to do was then genetically engineer a mouse where there were no rods, no cones, and what happened was that the circadian system was perfectly fine.
It remained intact.
It remained, you could regulate the clock perfectly well with light. And that discovery that there had to be another receptor led to Davidson working on the rat. We were working on the mouse, and Dennis Dacey on the macaque, a primate, showed that in fact there is a third receptor system. It's based upon a small number of ganglion cells. Now, the ganglion cells in the retina are those cells whose axons, whose projections, give rise to the optic nerve. And so 1 out of every 100 of those ganglion cells is directly light sensitive. And it uses a special light sensing molecule, a photopigment that has been called melanopsin, which was originally discovered by Iggy Prevencio, who was one of my first PhD students. In fact,
wow.
he went on and was working on the light-sensitive pigment cells in the skin of frogs. I mean, Iggy was fantastic. And when he left after his PhD, he said, I'm never going to work in mice again. They're smelly, they're expensive, and they bite me. So I'm going to work on frogs. And of course, in the process of doing that, he discovered that there was a light-sensitive photopigment in the skin. And what's truly remarkable is that same gene encoding that photopigment is turning up in those ganglion cells and in other structures as well. So there's this whole brightness detector system out there, which is regulating not only the clock, but a whole range of other things. One of our early discoveries was that these non-rod, non-cone photoreceptors, these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, actually contribute to the pupil constriction. And they're actually regulating other aspects of our physiology and behavior, not least sleep. They will directly interact with the sleep systems and either promote or inhibit sleep occurring.
So this third receptor that you've identified, it's necessary for regulating the circadian system, as you mentioned. And you mentioned this is an interaction with the visual system, which in your book you address then sort of the next problem from there is, well, then how do blind folks regulate their circadian rhythm?
Yes, and that's been one of the studies I've been really engaged with most recently. So we're working with Blind Veterans UK, and in fact, they have a close relationship with Blind Veterans USA. And so we've been working with those individuals. And the veterans are an extraordinary group. They are determined to be independent and live as normal a life as possible, despite their loss of eyes or radical destruction of their eye. And, in the conversations, one chap was telling me, I feel as though I'm being constantly tricked by my body. It's telling me when I should get up and go to bed, but then my friends and family are still asleep. And one said, I remember what jet lag was like, and this is unremitting, constant jet lag. And so it's a really devastating impact. You've lost your sense of space through vision, but you've also lost your sense of time. So again, one chap was saying, I knew on a Wednesday I would cut the grass. And so I woke up, I knew it was Wednesday, and so went downstairs and started cutting the grass. And that's pretty impressive. I mean, they've worked out ways in which you can get the lawnmower out,
right.
and cut the grass. And of course, they can't see the impact of cutting the grass.
Right.
But then this chap's wife came down and said, I think you need to stop. It's 3:00 in the morning. And it gives you a sense that these individuals are time blind. And so what we've been doing most recently is, because since the discovery of these receptors, a big chunk of what we've been doing, and we're one of the few labs really involved in this area, is trying to deduce how they signal to the molecular clockwork. What are they actually doing? We've got some great discoveries over the past few years, and I work very closely with Johnathan in the team. And in the process of understanding those signaling pathways, we can then think about ways of triggering those signaling pathways to fool the clock that it's seen light.
Oh.
It's so cool because we've done all the mouse work, and we can actually shift the biological clock of mice using a drug which we know is activating the same pathway that light activates. So we've gone all the way through that. In fact, we've gone to first in human trials, which we're collaborating with our colleagues in Australia, and they have shown that the drug is safe. We kind of knew it would be because it's what's called a repurposed drug. So It was developed for something else. In fact, Parkinson's. It didn't work for Parkinson's, but they went to extensive clinical trials. And so we've replicated those, does it do any harm? No, it doesn't. So we're now ready to work with our friends and colleagues in blind veterans to work on those individuals who have no eyes. And can we give them back a sense of time? I'm sure we can. So I think that if I can end my career with that, I will be more than happy. But I suppose the implications of it's more than the blind. We've worked on different patient groups. One group has been schizophrenia, and where the sleep-wake profile of those individuals is absolutely smashed. And what I envisage these drugs to be useful for is giving you sort of a stabilization, getting everything realigned, and then using light or to continue with that stabilization. But the clock disturbance in those individuals is so profound. I think we need to sort of use a drug to ease it into the right place, and then use light.
What does the sleep profile of someone with schizophrenia look like?
It's very variable, from the extreme of an utterly smashed clock with no 24-hour patterns at all. I mean, it really is. When I first saw the data, I was absolutely gobsmacked, to individuals who are either drifting through time as if they had no eyes, but they seem to be fully sighted, to others showing massively fragmented patterns. So it's very variable. And I think what that variability might indicate is the variable underlying nature of schizophrenia. We now know that there's not a gene for schizophrenia.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of sort of things that line up. And I suspect the sleep-wake pattern that you get might actually give us a handle on the underlying nature of the condition.
That's fascinating. And just anecdotally, I used to work at a school for blind students, and I would notice in the mornings that a lot of them would come in very sleepy. They were younger students, so I just attributed it to that. Yeah. But I'm just sort of imagining sort of the impact of a drug like that in those populations. So what would that look like? Is it that they take a pill every day? And
they take a pill every day at a particular time, and that would hopefully stabilize the clock. Now, I think what we need to do in parallel with the drug development is get a very simple app saying, ping, now is the right time, you take your tablet.
Mm-hmm.
There will also be some variability. As I said, most people have slightly long body clocks, so we know when to give a drug. But there is a small percentage which have short body clocks, about 10%. So we might want to give the drug at a slightly different time. So it's not completely trivial, but it's all resolvable and easy to do.
Right. So you mentioned a number of things. I'm going to backtrack with you a little bit. So you referred to the suprachiasmatic nucleus a little.
I'm sorry, I'm a pedant. I have to correct you.
Yes.
Suprachiasmatic nuclei.
Nuclei.
Oh dear! Everybody listening is going to think, "Oh, what a nerd!" It's a purge. It's a paired structure. So
no, you did explain this to me, so that is my fault.
No, but everybody makes that mistake.
And you referred to it as the master clock.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of thinking from an evolutionary perspective, and you write from a comparative physiology perspective.
Yeah.
How basal is that? Do we see that in other animals?
Yes. The non-mammalian vertebrates are really weird, though. They have, so if we think about birds, they will have their master clock can be like in the suprachiasmatic nuclei. It can be the eye. There are some birds where the master clock is in the eye. Other birds where the master clock is in the pineal gland. So it depends. And in fact, they have multiple master clocks, as it were, and so they will all interact. And we don't know why. One of my great mentors, Mike Menneker, was always fascinated with why do some birds do it some ways and some do it another way? And in fact, why is there this diversity in circadian structures in the non-mammalian vertebrates? It's the same with photoreceptors. We have our weird photoreceptor in the eye, but a bird can have a light-sensitive pineal. My PhD work was actually studying light sensors within the brain of birds, in the hypothalamus. Lots of light. People think, oh, don't be daft. How can light get in through the brain? Well, huge amounts of light gets through the brain and is stimulating the cells directly involved in fact, reproductive processes. So with the increasing day lengths of spring, this is detected by a photoreceptor, measured by a clock, and then triggers a whole reproductive response in those birds. And reptiles, again, and amphibians have lots of different sorts of photoreceptors. And the question that I think is so fascinating, it's something that Mike Menneker was also, we'd spend lovely evenings discussing this sort of thing, is why are the mammals so different? And I think the consensus is that our evolutionary history is very distinctive. When the archosaurs, the great ruling reptiles, the dinosaurs, dominated the earth, our ancestors were scurrying out of burrows at twilight.
Right.
And there probably wouldn't have been enough light for long enough to be detected by a brain photoreceptor or a photoreceptor buried beneath the skull. So we lost our extra retinal photoreceptors, but retained our weird photoreceptors within the eye. And I think that's a really fascinating thing about mammals. We are rather different from the other vertebrates. Another example, our color vision is really quite primitive compared to the reptiles or the birds. We've actually had to re-evolve color vision, whereas a parrot will have exquisite sensitivity, for example, in the red. We just see it as red, and they will see it as infinite hues of red. It's really, we're very weird in lots of ways as mammals.
So what is the evolutionary advantage in the way that we sleep as humans? Why did we evolve to sleep in the patterns that we do? And why do we sleep at all?
Well, okay. So I have a very distinctive view about this, and not everybody agrees with me, including some very close colleagues in Oxford. Vlad Vazovsky, again, you're talking of sitting up, talking about science. He and I differ on my definition of sleep. So I think sleep has its origins, of course, within the circadian system. A very early evolutionary decision was, am I going to be adapted to daytime, or am I going to be adapted to nighttime. You can't do both. The specializations are so demanding that you can't be a generalist. You have to have a specialist. So once you've decided, as it were, to be either day active or night active, you then allocate a whole bunch of your biology to a particular phase, a particular time of the light-dark cycle. And so my definition of sleep would be a period of physical inactivity during which time you do not move around within an environment to which you're poorly adapted, but during which time you do a whole bunch of really important biology. So if you developed a whole bunch of metabolic toxins that you've built up during activity during the day, you compartmentalize that. You then, in time, you then start to clear and package up those toxins at night. If you've acquired all this wonderful information during the day, it's difficult to consolidate it to memory and then process it while you're getting more sensory information coming in. So you sort of kind of park it, and then whilst you're asleep, you consolidate it or ignore it, or you actually, our grandparents were right. If you think on a problem, you kind of get the right answer when you sleep. The data for that are, Granny was right. And so it's this time when we do essential biology, but by compartmentalizing physiology at a particular time, you make it very, very efficient. So that would be kind of my long-winded description of sleep, a period of physical inactivity where you're not moving around an environment to which we're poorly adapted, but during which time you do essential biology. And it's now very clear that the quality of our sleep defines the quality of our wake state.
I want to break down that sleep cycle with you, because as you're saying, in this theory that you're proposing, that our sleep cycles are essential in doing essential biology for while we're awake. So what are we doing at night? And that's so necessary for when we're wakeful. What's going on in the physiology?
Well, a big chunk of information that's emerged over the past few years has been memory consolidation. That's when we sort of consolidate our facts that we've acquired during the day. We either forget them or we consolidate them. The data that I have been most impressed with has been from Jan Born's group. And what he did was to devise a problem, which people then had to solve. And he introduced the problem to one group in the morning and then asked them to perform it in the afternoon. And only about 20% of the group solved the problem. The next group, introduced to the task in the morning, performed it the following afternoon, but they had no sleep. And about 20% of the group got it, nicely controlling for fatigue. But the really interesting group, of course, is introduced to the task in the morning, perform it the following afternoon after normal sleep, and 60 to 70% of the group solved the problem.
Wow.
And that's just a spectacular example of how a night of sleep can help us come up with novel solutions to complex problems. And boy, do we not need that facility at the moment. But the other thing is to some extent, the importance of sleep is often defined on the basis of what happens when we don't get it. And some other studies have shown that the tired brain only remembers negative experiences, but not positive ones.
Really?
Which I think is, again, really interesting. And of course, it makes evolutionary sense, because you're gonna remember that the stuff that could potentially harm you. But what it means is, if you're constantly tired, your entire worldview, the way you base, the way you build your decisions, the way you interact with others, will have a negative bias versus a positive bias. And so, again, a really important aspect of sleep. So much, goes on. We talked about toxin clearance very specifically. Right. There's a misfolded protein called beta amyloid, which has been associated with the development of dementia and Alzheimer's. And we know that beta amyloid is packaged up and cleared whilst we sleep. There's a new clearance system that's been discovered called the glymphatic system. And that's very active whilst we sleep. And those data sort of underpin the observations that severely disrupted sleep in the middle years can predispose you to Alzheimer's and dementia in later years. Now, it's not everybody, but if you are predisposed to that track,
Right.
then poor sleep in the middle years is going to nudge you closer to that trajectory. So yeah, I think there's incredible amounts that we're learning.
You mentioned schizophrenia earlier in our conversation, and then you mentioned the potential onset of Alzheimer's given lack of sleep. So is sleep a fundamental predictor of mental illness or a contributing factor?
Yeah. So I got into studying mental illness because I had a very irritating conversation with a psychiatrist in an elevator, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh yeah, you work on sleep," and I said, "Well, sort of. I work on circadian rhythms, but yeah, there we go." And he said, "Oh yeah, well, my patients don't sleep." He was working on schizophrenia because they don't have a job, so they go to bed late, get up late, miss my clinic, and don't have friends. And I thought it was just daft. So then got together with some other psychiatrists and Katharina Wolff, a close colleague, and we looked at the sleep-wake patterns of individuals with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And as I mentioned, they were completely smashed. And then I thought, well, hang on, why is this? And we then built a very simplistic model about thinking of the relationship between sleep-wake disruption and mental illness. And what is clear is that the sleep systems draw from all of the brain neurotransmitters. In that flip-flop from consciousness to sleep,
right,
every brain neurotransmitter is involved at some level.
Wow.
So we thought, hang on, if there's a change in a neurotransmitter that predisposes you to a mental health issue, dopamine, serotonin, or whatever, it's going to have an impact upon sleep at some level. So we then thought, okay, but it's going to be more than that. So there could well be this overlap. But of course, the poor sleep, because it has such a distorting effect upon physiology and behavior, not least one's negative bias, for example, of the world, then it's going to exacerbate the mental health status. And of course, the mental health status could feed back and make the sleep worse. And there may be a contribution of the drugs. So these were predictable points. So we looked for genes that have been associated with mental illness and looked to see whether they had a role in the circadian and sleep systems. And many, many do, which is really interesting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating is some of the genes that have been linked to sleep and circadian rhythms have been linked to mental illness. So there is that mechanistic overlap. And one experimental approach was to take, there's a gene called SNAP25, which has been linked to human schizophrenia. So what happens when you mutate that gene in a mouse? Well, you get abnormal behaviors. You can't say you've got a schizophrenic mouse, but you've got some abnormal cognitive and behaviors. But in parallel with that, you have smashed sleep-wake cycles. So there was empirical evidence that one gene mutated was not only affecting behavior, but was also affecting the clock. So support for that mechanistic overlap concept. What about it then? If we can consolidate sleep even partially in individuals, will we reduce levels of psychiatric illness? So Dan Freeman is a psychiatrist here in Oxford, and he led the trial whereby individuals who were showing insomnia and were showing paranoia and hallucinatory experiences, if after partial sleep deprivation, would those conditions improve? And they did.
Wow.
And that, I think, is so exciting because we can think now of the circadian sleep systems as being a new therapeutic target in mental illness. So that's the way the things have gone forward. So it really is extraordinary. A casual conversation in an elevator, which irritated me, has now led to a different way of thinking about mental illness. And going back to your original point, yes, the poor health is endemic in mental illness, as you probably may know from your studies. So with people with severe mental illness, the life expectancy is reduced by, on average, 25 years, which is huge. And what do they have? Well, they have coronary heart disease, they have metabolic abnormalities, they have obesity. Now, not all of it will be due to the sleep-wake disruption, but the sleep-wake disruption will certainly contribute to those poor health outcomes.
Right. I think that's fascinating that, as you mentioned, just like a small interaction that kind of frustrated you could lead to such a fundamental shift in the way we look at mental illness, given the light of circadian rhythms. So that I'm excited to see what work comes out of that. It sounds really exciting there. I want to ask you about, so you're talking about the flip-flop between the conscious and unconscious states that we know as sleep. So what's happening there? And when I ask you what's happening there, I mean, so we go into this unconscious state and we produce dreams and sort of things of this nature. What is our best guess as to what the role of dreams are and their evolutionary advantage in all this?
Yeah. So of course, sleep is highly structured. You've got this cycle of non-REM going from an electrical activity that you can record from the surface of the skin on the skull. Very small, low amplitude, very high frequency oscillations when you're awake. And that gets bigger and slower until you get into deep sleep with slow rolling electrical waves. And that's the phase when we probably are consolidating our memory and processing information. There's some sort of dreaming going on in slow wave sleep, but actually it's the other phase of sleep, which is called REM sleep. So you bounce from slow, deep, non-REM sleep into REM sleep. And it's then you have your vivid and most complicated dreams. So why? Well, there's no complete consensus, but I suppose what people would mostly say is that REM sleep is that phase of sleep when we're dealing with our emotional issues. We're trying to sort of work through any issues that we might be having. An illustration of that was a lovely study that looked at New Yorkers after the Twin Towers were destroyed by terrorist action. And people were not recapitulating that experience. They weren't seeing in their dreams towers, planes going to towers, which is interesting because, of course, that was the image that kept on going on the television.
Right.
What their anxiety dreams were of being mugged or being overwhelmed by a tsunami. And so this has been part of the evidence base that dreaming is our brain trying to make sense of a complicated emotional state. So, in fact, dreams are great. I mean, they help us sort out a complicated world. And I sort of kind of likened it to a jigsaw puzzle. So you can think of it, there's a partly formed jigsaw puzzle within the brain. And then new bits of information come in. And then whilst we're asleep, we're trying to sort of put those new bits of the jigsaw puzzle in place. Now, sometimes we get it right. We put it in the right place. Other times we're putting it into the wrong place. And so there's bizarre associations and weird coincidences. And again, I think it's just the brain rifling through and trying to make sense of a complicated world. Many people get very anxious about their dreams, and you shouldn't, because it's a sign that the brain is doing what it's supposed to do, which is help you survive, dealing with ghastly things. But I should say, a lot of people feel that dreams have predictive value,
right, I was
and
going to mention that.
All the rest of it. There is absolutely no scientific evidence that they are used, that they have any function in that sense.
So what if you have, I think the argument back to what you just said might be, what if you have recurring dreams and they terrorize you?
Yeah, well, and of course, post-traumatic stress is an example. Now, post-traumatic is different because that is a recapitulation of the event. You constantly re-see that horrifying incident, and so that's different from classical dreaming, whereby you're processing an emotional set of responses. Recurrent dreams, and I the one I still have is the one where you realize you've got an exam the next day and you haven't done any revision for it. Even at my great age, I still have that recurrent dream, which is interestingly enough, during times of anxiety and stress. That's the thing that pops back into my cortex.
That is interesting. So they're not entirely random.
No, they will. They definitely have a structure. And are they important? Well, I guess yes, they are important. But do they influence our wake time actions? And largely not, because most of us don't remember them. Again, it's the brain, working undercover,
Right.
Trying to kind of get the facts right and get things sorted so that you are most able to make an important decision based upon what your brain has retained and processed when you're awake.
I see. So we talked about the productive things the brain does while unconscious, while asleep, and we sort of dipped our toe into the extreme ends of these breaks in circadian rhythm patterns and their influence in sort of mental health. But just generally, outside of those two domains, when we don't get enough sleep, what happens to the brain?
So you can think of this at a number of levels. So the short-term effects of not getting enough sleep would be increased impulsivity. So we fail to reflect upon our actions. So we do stupid and unreflective things. We think, "Oh, I can get that red stoplight." Actually, you can't. And if you were fully rested, you wouldn't. So stupid and unreflective things, increased irritability, the failure to be able to concentrate and multitask are all features of not getting enough sleep, and the loss of empathy, which I think is
really
so interesting.
That is interesting.
The failure to pick up the social signals from friends, colleagues, and family degrades. So all of the wonderful things that the brain allows us to do that essentially makes us human, including our sense of humor, incidentally, is affected by short-term loss of sleep. And we've all experienced this. When you go into longer-term loss of sleep as a result of night shift work, for example,
right,
then you've got some real problems. So the first point is that most night shift workers don't shift their body clock with the demands of working at night. And the assumption has been, well, you do adapt, and you don't. 97% of night shift workers do not adapt. And they don't adapt because of light exposure. You're working with dim light, relatively dim light in the workplace at night, in the factory or in the offices. But then you experience bright natural light on the journey home. And the clock always defers to the bright light signal as being daytime. So the clock doesn't shift. You get over jet lag because, of course, you're exposed to light in the new time zone. But that's the only game in town.
Right.
And so there is that real tension for night shift workers. And so their entire biology is saying, now you should be asleep. And so what night shift workers have to do is override that biology, and I'll say it again, that deep biology saying you should be asleep. And part of the way you override that is to activate the stress axis. And of course, stress is good. It's like the first gear in a car. It gives you that wonderful acceleration. You can get away, you can do the stuff, you can fight or flight.
Right.
But if you keep the engine in first gear, you destroy it. And that's rather like keeping the stress axis on all the time, which is why you find high levels of coronary heart disease, increased blood pressure, of course, during the stress axis, diabetes too, because you're throwing glucose into the circulation, to burn it off, to fight or flight, increased levels of obesity as a consequence of that. You've got high rates of cancer. Now, why is that? And that's probably because increased stress suppresses the immune responses, and suppressed immunity increases your risk for both cancer and, of course, infection. And so, you've got these big conditions, coronary heart disease,
right.
You've got metabolism, diabetes too, and you've got cancer, all being more prominent in long-term night shift workers.
Right.
To the extent that the World Health Organization has said that night shift work is a probable carcinogen.
Wow.
The data's that strong. And I think it's tricky. We live in a 24/7 society, and we're not going to put that genie back in its bottle.
Right.
So what do we do?
Exactly.
And I think this is where I part of the reason for writing Lifetime was to think about, how do we mitigate? What can we do now on the basis of the knowledge that we have? So, driving home after the night shift. There was a study on junior doctors in the UK showing that 57% of junior doctors had either had a crash or a near miss driving home after the night shift. 57%.
Wow.
So why aren't we providing simple apps you can put on your phone, you can clip on your dashboard, which track eye movement or the fact that the car is moving laterally, and signal an alert. Of course, high-end German cars are now, they have that alerting system. But that's something we could easily do. Knowing there are higher rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes 2, obesity. What kind of food should we be making available to our night shift workers? Well, it shouldn't be fast food, high fat, high sugar. So why is nobody developing a simple, protein-rich, easy to digest, snack that can sustain you across the night shift? Knowing that there are these increased levels of illness, why don't we institute higher frequency health checks for that particular sector to try and catch these conditions before they become chronic? Knowing that the divorce rate is 6 times higher in certain sectors of night shift workers compared to day shift workers, why aren't we providing education not only for the individual to understand what the consequences of doing night shift are,
right,
and to look for those problems, and but also for their family and the people that they spend their lives with, and they can then realize it's not that these people have turned into monsters. This is a biological consequence of driving biology outside of its normal range. And I should say that there's some very interesting studies on night shift workers which have shown that if you maintain a healthy diet, if you do lots of exercise, the frequency of developing type 2 diabetes, for example, drops hugely.
Really?
So there are things that we can do with education, with changing nutrition. There's one more area which I've it's kind of maybe a bit hokey, but I think it's quite good. It's quite a good idea, which is that we know there are different sorts of individuals: morning people, intermediate people, and evening people. We have different chronotypes.
Now, is that just a temperament? Because I think people use that in colloquial language. Oh, yeah. I'm a morning person, or I'm a night owl.
No, there's a biological basis for it, and we can unpack that.
Sure.
But wouldn't it make sense to put the night owls on the night shift and the morning people on the morning shift? And what you want to avoid at all costs is a night person doing, the morning shift.
Right.
So chronotyping the workforce so that the variation that we see across humans, and it's huge, you can map body clock type onto when you need to be active.
So when you're referring to these chronotypes, like what percentage of the population would be a morning person, night person? You said there's wide variation.
Yeah, it's about, if I can remember the statistics, it's about 10% of the population are morning, extreme, larks. About 65% will be intermediate types, and the rest tend to be later types. And there are more later types than there are early morning types.
Right.
Yeah.
I think all the solutions that you've proposed, they're rooted in science, of course, and they're applicable, especially in like more Western countries where these resources are available. Like you could allocate money in XYZ way and make these things happen. But they're also very idealistic, right? Some people, they're just a product of their circumstance, and maybe they have to work a night shift,
well,
right?
They do, yes.
So what about for those folks? What are some actionable things they can do?
Well, certainly the sorts of things that we've talked about.
Yes.
Make sure that if you're on the night shift, that you are eating correctly, that you will be predisposed for weight gain, diabetes too. So do the exercise, eat right, where you can catch up with sleep, and just live the healthiest style you can.
Right.
But be aware that there are dangers, and in fact, the problems of night shift work increase with the number of years you do it.
Okay.
And so I think it would be an interesting sort of study to see if you cycled people in and out, that you didn't work longer than 5 years, let's say,
Sure.
and then you cycled out, and then you cycle back in perhaps. But you'd need a sympathetic employer to do that. And of course, as we've been discussing, there's a huge economic driver for doing night shift work. It's usually people from a lower socioeconomic group.
Right.
They are marginalized, and we don't think about them.
Mm-hmm.
And we should start to, because our economy is entirely dependent upon them. And so we've got to give them more respect and more help. And I think, engage. I suppose also, yes, that's the idealist bit. And I feel quite passionately that they are a marginalized group and we do need to do some more for them. But also the pragmatist in me says, well, hang on. You're going to have, as an employer, a class action suit saying, I crashed my car, killed somebody on the drive home after the night shift. You didn't give me any warning that I might be, show increased tiredness. You didn't give me any advice about what I should do in terms of dealing with the drive home or the accident in the workplace and somebody gets very badly injured because, of course, they're falling to sleep, their vigilance drops. It's worth bearing in mind that one's ability to process information at 4:00 in the morning is worse than if you've consumed sufficient alcohol to make you legally drunk.
Really? It's comparable.
It's actually worse. Some wonderful studies by Drew Dawson in Australia showed this very clearly. So, if you're driving a car at 4:00, 5:00 in the morning, it's your ability to drive that car is worse than if you were legally drunk.
Wow.
And of course, accounting for traffic volume, that's when many of the accidents occur. Right. And it's when many of the fatal accidents occur. Because the problem is, you're falling asleep and you don't have, you're unconscious. So the car can go off in lots of different directions. You're probably also going at quite a high speed. Mm-hmm. And so these accidents tend also to be fatal. So you're going to have people saying to an employer, you didn't warn me. You didn't provide anything for me. I've now got cancer. I've now got diabetes too. You made no provision in the workplace to help me. Now, in fairness to the employers, they're only just becoming aware of this. But I think what you need to do is get a proper dialogue between scientists, employers and employees to develop best practice in the workplace to deal with night shift work. Because if you don't, we're going to have a horrible legal mess whereby proper constructive discussion then falls apart. We're going to become sort of backed into corners,
right.
And that's the last thing that I would want. So I'm really pushing for dialogue and engagement. And in fact, some sectors of the business community are taking
they?
That's
what I was going to ask you. Have you seen any uptake?
We've just done some work on white collar shift workers, and that's a group that hasn't really been studied, and the statistics are really awful. I mean, it's as you would expect, emotional problems, depression, just you name it, metabolic problems. And so what we now need to do is work with the banking sector to say, okay, what can we do to try and mitigate some of the problems? You're not going to get rid of it,
right?
But there's a duty of care where you can mitigate some of these problems. And that's my frustration, because there's nobody really mitigating those issues at the moment.
You mentioned just before chronotypes, and that there is a biological basis for saying that you're a morning person or you're a night owl.
Yeah.
So what is the biology of a morning person exactly? What does that mean?
It's so interesting. So there's genetics. So we now know specific clock genes, and subtle changes in some of those clock genes can either speed up or slow down the clock and make you more of a morning person or an evening person. So there's genetics. So as somebody in the fields once said, by their contribution to our genes, our parents are still telling us what time to get up and go to bed.
Is that your quote?
No, it's not. But I wish it were. I've used it a lot, though.
That's good.
And so there's genetics, there's age. And this is so interesting. From about the age of 10, some really beautiful work has been done in Toronto in this area. From about the age of 10, there's a tendency to want to go to bed later and later. So by the time you're in your late teens, early 20s, this is when we're our latest.
Okay.
Men tend to get later than women, and women peak. Their lateness peaks at about 19 and a half, and men about 21 or so.
Okay.
And they, on average, tend to be later. Then there's a slow move to want to go to bed earlier. The bottom line is that the time you're in your late 50s, early 60s, you're getting up and going to bed at about the time you got up and went to bed when you were 10. And the difference...
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, and the difference is around 2 hours between somebody in their late 50s, early 60s and somebody in their in their late teens, early 20s. Certainly as a university student. I mean, I was very late. I mean, I would stay up half the night. Now I don't. I've become an old man and I'm sort of going to bed early and getting up early, but still relatively later than people of my age group.
Fair.
So you've got genetics, you've got age, and it's almost certainly associated with a change in the sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone in women. And there's good sort of support for those changes. The third area, which is really important and often overlooked, is when you see light.
Okay.
So morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier. Evening light delays the clock, makes you get up later. Now, when we were all agricultural workers, we got symmetrical exposure to light, to dawn and dusk.
Right.
And so we were shift forward and then back again. And so we stayed aligned. Now, what many people experience in our modern society is only partial exposure to dawn or dusk. And this is a classic problem for teenagers and young adults. We did a study a few years ago looking at university students, and we found that the later the chronotype of the student, the less morning light they were exposed to, which would advance the clock, make them get up earlier, but they were getting late afternoon, evening light, which would delay the clock, make them go to bed later. So part of the issue is when you see light. So if you happen to be a late person,
right,
you can kind of nudge yourself a bit forward in time, set the alarm clock, get out there, get bright natural light if you can. If it's winter, then sit in front of a light box. So you've got genetics, you've got age, hormonal status, and of course you've got when you see light. And of course a fourth factor is social media, which is sort of driving you later. And many young people are immensely anxious. They know that they know it's not a good idea to use social media in the early hours of the morning, but the consequence of not being connected to your peer group is terrifying for some. And so, some kids are up half the night, which leads me into napping, because what you find with young people is that they're going to sleep late, they're getting up early, the alarm clock is driving them out of bed. They're struggling through school, and many teachers, report that their students are actually falling asleep in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
They then go home, and then they have a long sleep. And what that long sleep, relatively close to bedtime, means is you push back the pressure for sleep that night. So it's more difficult to get to sleep because you've had that long nap. And so you've got that additional societal interaction, social media, also interacting with those biological drivers, which drive particularly teenagers to later and later bedtimes. Now, the key thing is, these are all things that we can do something about.
Of course.
And that's, again, part of the message of Lifetime, which is, understanding the biology means that it empowers us to do something about it.
Right. I want to ask you about that social media piece that you mentioned there. So is it just the act of scrolling social media and being inundated with new ideas, or is it the light being emitted from the phone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media about looking at devices before you go to sleep, because the light from those devices will delay the clock. Of course, it's evening time, evening light delays the clock. The data supporting that is immensely weak. So a famous study really looked at Kindle use prior to sleep time. So the experiment involved 4 hours of continuous use of a Kindle on its brightest light intensity on 5 consecutive nights.
All right.
And at the end of 5 nights, it delayed sleep onset just statistically by 10 minutes. And as one of my colleagues said, well, it may be statistically significant, but that's biologically meaningless.
Fair, yeah.
I mean, 10 minutes is nothing with all the other variables going on within our life. Mm-hmm. So the role of light in delaying the clock at night from devices is probably minimal. I'm not saying it doesn't have any effect. It will have some effect. And it will depend upon its brightness. And of course, light is not only interacting with the circadian systems, but it's also interacting with our alerting systems. So the brighter the light, the more alert we are. Now, I think it's rather ironic that the last thing that many of us do before we go to bed, we stand in the most brightly illuminated room, the bathroom, looking into an illuminated mirror, if you can stand it,
right.
Cleaning your teeth. And that's probably not smart. And again, I've always puzzled that there are not manufacturers producing a bathroom mirror with a night setting, which is sort of dimmer, and a morning setting, which is much brighter, which will increase the lightness and help regulate the clock. So the circadian system, we talked about those novel receptors.
Mm-hmm.
Humans are relatively massively insensitive to light in terms of the circadian system.
Interesting.
And in fact, it wasn't until 1987, and again, I was fortunate enough to be at that meeting, when the Honmas showed the first really good evidence that the human circadian system is regulated by light. And they had an experiment where individuals were exposed to, I think it was 6 hours of light for 5,000 lux. Now that's brightish light. I mean, if you think about the environment, so the brightest day would be something like 100,000 lux. Moonlight would be 1 lux or so.
Okay.
So this is the sort of levels of light you'd encounter outside, or relatively early in the morning, and they showed light had an effect. Before that, people were saying, well, it's probably social cues. It's when you eat, it's when you interact that set the clock. They do have a mild modulating effect, but it's light that's the most important. And this was missed because people had used levels of light which are effective in mice or rats, which are very low. They can regulate their clocks with low levels of light and relatively briefly. We need bright light for an extended period of time. As I say, those experiments had, I think it was 5,000 lux for 6 hours. And indeed, all the experiments that have been done on human regulation by light have long duration, 6.5 hours. Now, you can get an effect with, let's say, 200 or so lux, but it has to be at durations of 6 or 7 hours. And so that's the key thing. We are, of course, sensitive to light. That's what regulates our clock, but we need bright light of a long duration to have a big effect. And so that's why I think it's not the light before we go to bed from devices, it's the alerting effect they have on the brain. That and of course, a smartphone is going to be much more activating than Kindle. A Kindle is, if you happen to be reading your favorite Jane Austen, your relaxing novel, then it's probably going to be good for you. If you're using a smartphone where you're looking at your emails, you're looking at, all the various Facebooks and various other things, that's going to be much more alerting. And particularly, and we've all experienced this, if we look at an email, which is particularly irritating before we go to sleep, it delays sleep. Worst experience I had of that was I just got a BlackBerry and I went and I spent wonderful time at University of Western Australia in Perth. And so, I'd had my BlackBerry, and I don't know if you remember, they had this wonderful little red light when new information had popped in. So during the day, I did my Australian emails, and then the European ones would come in, and then the North American ones would come in. And it was
annoying.
And of course you've got jet lag, so you're not, you're still recovering, adjusting. So first of all, I started with the phone by my bed and then put it in the next room. And I was so weak, I then just left it in the lab because I was, and it's really tricky. And I think we can get hooked with these things. And so it requires, discipline.
I think that's a great point to distinguish between. I think there is this idea that it's the light that's coming out of the phone that's keeping us up, but I think it's those other factors that are just grabbing our attention and then keeping us up.
Yes.
So you mentioned there's other regulators of the circadian clock there, and you refer to diet and then exercise.
Yes.
So what other things can we do to sort of regulate that clock?
Well, certainly there's some very nice data showing that exercise, particularly in the morning, can be useful in setting the clock. And so that's one area. eating at the same time every day seems to be very important at regulating the circadian network that we talked about. So yeah, try and make one's routines a routine as much as you can. And eating, I think, is really important because our dietary patterns have changed over a relatively short period of time.
Right.
Up until my grandparents' generation, the big meal of the day was breakfast and lunch, and people, because they worked close to where they lived, they come home for lunch, and then there'd be supper, a light supper before they went to bed. Because now we work often miles and miles away from where we live, the commutes there means you don't have time for a proper breakfast. The demands of work means you grab a sandwich while you're still sitting at your desk. And then finally, the commute home, you get home late. And what's the easiest thing to do? Put a meal in the microwave and wait until it goes ping. And we've all done it.
Right.
We all do it. But in fact, it's been shown that the same meal at 8 a.m. versus 8 p.m. Will have much higher levels of blood glucose at 8 p.m. than 8 a.m. If you think about it, our metabolism is utterly different during the day and the night. We're consuming, we should be consuming our calories during the day, and so we're burning those up, we're using them. At night, of course, we're not eating anything, so we're mobilizing stored calories to burn up to keep us alive. And so that's one explanation why exercise first thing in the morning prior to breakfast can be very helpful, because you're still on nighttime metabolism. You're still burning stored calories. So the exercise then can be really good. Now, that's great if you're a morning person. Something like me, it's absolutely a disaster. And it's also important that our capacity for exercise, the amount of strength and duration we can apply to exercise, increases throughout the day, and peaking in the late afternoon, early evening. So if you want to burn the calories that you've consumed during the day, then late afternoon, early evening exercise is good for that. So what a lot of people do is they sort of do their 10 minutes. They can just about manage 10 minutes in the morning.
Right.
And they have their main bout of exercise later in the day. And that seems to work really very well. Another really interesting factoid, which I find fascinating, is that people with dogs, this may amuse your listeners, people with dogs have better sleep patterns.
Why is that?
Well,
that's an interesting finding.
We don't know, but I think the explanation is, of course, if you've got a dog, you have to take it out for a walk first thing in the morning.
Right.
And so you're getting your morning exposure to light, which is setting the clock, and also you're combining it with some exercise. So, yes, so dog owners, at least if you take them out for a walk.
Right.
have better sleep patterns. I don't know how good the data are, but it kind of makes sense.
That's funny. I guess you could prescribe a dog to someone who's having trouble sleeping or regulating their sleep, if you will.
Well, yes. And in fact, companion animals are recommended under certain circumstances, and, particularly with emotional and mental illness. And of course, if you're stabilizing your sleep-wake cycle by taking the dog out first thing in the morning, as you have to, then you can understand why a companion animal might be contributing, not only because of its sort of interaction behaviorally, but it's actually getting you out doing exercise and light first thing in the morning.
Yeah, I think we speak about it humorously, but you make a profound point there. What I wanted to ask you about was people who fail to regulate their sleep, they often think that the first catch-all solution might be to go on some type of medication.
Yes.
Ideally, that would be sort of the last line of attack there for that problem. So, how do we delineate between who that's actually useful for, and maybe what should everybody else sort of be considering before they get there?
Yeah, it's complicated, but it's very important to appreciate that sedatives, sleeping tablets, are sedatives. They do not provide a biological mimic for sleep. In fact, some of the sedatives can actually harm memory consolidation and the processing of information. Many people, of course, use alcohol as a sedative. And so that will sort of knock you out, but it actually doesn't provide good sleep. Sustained sleep, and again can severely inhibit memory and processing of information. Short-term use of prescribed medication to try and consolidate the sleep-wake cycle is fine.
Okay.
The long-term use is what I think everybody would suggest is a poor idea. There's also, it's not a smart idea for aged individuals, and particularly individuals who are showing signs of dementia and Alzheimer's. And of course, the sleep-wake cycles fall apart quite significantly in that group, because it might knock you out, but then it results in lots of daytime sleepiness. And also, if you wake up in the night, it can lead to falls and therefore, other issues. So, medications for sleep are not recommended in the elderly, and particularly the elderly with dementia and Alzheimer's. What you do? Well, again, we go back to my favorite topic of light. And it's been shown, some researchers in the Netherlands, As van Summeren's group, increased the amount of light in the nursing home, 2,000 lux during the day, darkness in the bedrooms at night, and it consolidated the sleep-wake profile in many individuals. And those with a consolidated sleep-wake profile showed an improvement in their cognition by almost 10%. So it's a very important set of interactions,
right.
That we don't always have to resort to medications. It raises the other point, of course, which is, why don't we teach our general practitioners and our medics more about the importance of sleep and circadian rhythms?
What education do clinicians get, let's say in medical school or in nursing school? What type of education are they getting?
Very little indeed. And so, for example, when do you take your antihypertensives?
Mm-hmm.
These drugs which lower blood pressure, reduce the chances of a stroke. Well, the data now are very clear. Taking them before you go to bed rather than first thing in the morning can halve your risk of a stroke over a 10 to 15 year period. So this is a big effect.
Right.
But most general practitioners are not aware of that. In fact, if they're aware of anything, is that stroke is most frequent first thing in the morning. You wake up, blood pressure rises, and you precipitate a stroke. But it takes a relatively long time for these drugs to kick in. So your window of stroke danger between 6 a.m. and 12 noon,
right.
The drugs are actually kicking in after that window. So
I see.
That's why you take them before you go to bed, so they remain high to intersect with that sharp rise first thing in the morning. Now, that isn't known by most practitioners. It's becoming more clear. And in fact, an Australian colleague of mine said, yes, in Tasmania at least, that's when we always tell our stroke, potential stroke patients, take your medication in the evening before you go to bed. But I was at a meeting just at the weekend, and somebody said, but I've been told I must take it in the morning. What's the evidence? And so, I sent them a copy of the paper.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Good.
And again, that's one of the exciting things about Lifetime, because science is constantly changing, and the statements we make now may be wrong or need refining in 5 years' time. But at least within the book, you can go to the source information. And I had this wonderful call just recently from a lady who said, "Oh, I was really fascinated to hear, you take your anti-stroke medication before you go to bed rather than first thing in the morning." And I told my husband, and he said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. It won't matter any time." And she said, "Well, why don't you go to the paper?" And of course, he got the paper, the reference from the book, read the paper, and said, "Oh my goodness, yes." And so he's changed his behavior. So, it's providing the current...
Fantastic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I was really thrilled to get that, because it's providing the current evidence base for people to make their own decisions about what they do about their health.
That's fantastic. And just on that same sort of vein, I think anyone who's reading your book or who may be listening to this, they're learning a lot about, their own circadian rhythm and sleep and these environmental cues that regulate all of these things. But what about people who are just so ingrained in the lifestyle they're living? They wake up with an alarm clock. They really grind it out at work. They come home. They eat a very big meal, but they don't necessarily feel as though they're suffering the consequences of irregulated circadian rhythm. How can you identify that you might have an issue?
Well, I think if people understand what you can gain from an understanding of your sleep and circadian rhythms, it's worth trying. I mean, I suppose the analogy would be, would you like to look through a window that is beautifully clear and transparent, or would you like to look through a frosted pane? And essentially, you don't gain as much by looking through a frosted pane.
Right.
And so, if you want to live a happy, fulfilled life, enjoy the company of others, enjoy this extraordinary world that we live on, and potentially live healthier and longer, then why would you not embrace this knowledge?
Right.
It's one of the great achievements of science in the late 20th and 21st centuries, and why would you ignore it?
I think that's a great response, and I think your book does a great job of giving people the resources in a very palatable way, in a very solution-oriented way, and it's a great read. It's a very interesting read. I did enjoy it. I want to ask you about your hopes for the field and maybe the future of this work and where is all this headed? We talked about policy and you talked about the implications for mental health. But what are your personal hopes for the field?
Well, I deal with that in the last chapter, and there are two areas. One is education, which is why aren't we embedding this information within our schools? Why isn't it part of the curriculum? It's 30% of our biology, our sleep biology, and we don't arm our young people with any of this information. And it's important information not just to do better in school, but it's stuff that you take with you for the rest of your life. So there's an education piece in schools. There's an education piece in the workplace. You talk to our frontline staff, and it's an incredibly grueling environment. I mean, just so for example, nurses working on the night shift. Well, we know that the immune system is slightly turned down at nighttime, so we're going to be more vulnerable to infection at night. So the use of protective clothing at nighttime is even more important. If you're getting a vaccine, so vaccination has different effects at different times. And furthermore, if you're tired and circadian rhythm disrupted, you can reduce the efficacy of vaccination. So really, our frontline staff need to make sure that they've rested for several days before their vaccination and immediately afterwards. Right. So they have the full benefit of the vaccination. So this is education that we could implement now for our frontline staff, our frontline nurses, for example. There's no education real education about the dangers of night shift work in our police. I talk about this in a book with I got to know a police officer who talked, and he approached me because one of his close friends after the night shift had fallen asleep and driven into a tree on the way home and was killed. And he wasn't warned of the dangers of this sort of thing. So I think we should embed this information in our medical students, in our workforce generally, and of course embed it early on with our school systems. That's the easy stuff in a sense.
Right.
What can we do where education isn't enough? And so if you think about some severe neurodevelopmental conditions where sleep-wake is immensely disrupted, and it's not only affecting the educational performance of those individuals already with difficulties, but the impact on the family is huge. So often waking up at night constantly, disrupting the entire family and all of the stress on that. And so what can we do? And at the moment, there's not a lot, which is why I'm excited with these, using the science now for the development of new drugs that can be used to regulate the circadian and the sleep-wake cycle. And I don't mean sleeping tablets. I mean actually a radical look at this. Let's look at the underlying mechanisms of how the clock works, how it's regulated, and how we can use that information to improve the sleep-wake timing and therefore the quality of life of these individuals, such as the blind, such as those with neurodevelopmental disorders, where there's not a lot you can do. It's no good, telling a blind person to get out there and see more light. They can't detect it. And so I think there's two elements. I think that we're now moving. It's very, very interesting. Many people in the field are doing this sort of thing. They're transitioning from essentially bench scientists to work with clinician scientists to embed it. So we actually have a meeting next week. The Leduc Foundation have funded a big international grant on the role of circadian rhythms and stroke. So we're getting together to try and think of ways in which we can use this knowledge to improve the outcome from a stroke and prevent it in the first place.
I think that's fantastic. And your book is a very good testament to just how far-reaching all of this science is, and just how far we've come in understanding all of these mechanisms. And the future does look quite optimistic in terms of applying these things.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, so you have to take that on board. But I do believe that we are at a very exciting stage where we're using this extraordinary science to inform health and well-being.
Right. Yeah, I think you're the perfect person for that message. You're clearly very optimistic and passionate. It radiates off you. It's been fantastic chatting. I just want to ask for the viewers, what are you up to next? Where can they find you? How can they support your work?
Send me an email. Just look up Russell Foster, University of Oxford. You'll find my email, and we can chat. And a lot of people do engage. It takes me sometimes a while to get back to you, but I always try. And often I just say, let's just pick up the phone and chat, because it's so much easier than writing 10 emails.
Right.
So yes, very happy for those who are interested. I mean, the point of the book, and indeed, the point of being a scientist is that we are paid servants of the general public. And we do our work because of public support, and therefore we have an absolute undiluted duty to deliver back and inform the people who are paying my wages what we're up to. So, and I think there's an increasing appreciation by most scientists that is a duty that should not be shirked.
I love that. You've been extremely charitable in sharing all of this, let's say, higher level information in such a palatable and applicable way.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking.
Oh, well, thank you very much.